Guten Tag, ich bin der Scriptmonk. This is going to be another shorter one again, but based on some of the discussion in the comments on my previous video, I thought I'd talk about a certain aspect of traditional movie structure that tends to remain kind of a mystery. See, as you may know, in the act structure of the traditional Hollywood-style movie story, the whole structural aspect comes from the more or less even arrangements of 5 major dramatic events. You have the inciting incident, the end of Act 1 turning point, the midpoint, the end of Act 2B turning point, and the Act 3 climax. But while there is a lot of consensus on what the first 2 events are supposed to do, along with a lot of agreements on the last 2, there is no consensus on just what the midpoint is supposed to do, or why it's even there. You know how they used to say there were 4 basic flavors, sweet, salty, bitter, and sour, but then one day they threw umami into the mix? So now most people forget umami, and even more don't even know what it is? Well, the midpoint is the umami of plot points. It came late to the party, and most people don't even know what it's doing there. However, the midpoint is actually a crucial moment in story structure. It's where the plot arc and the character arc really click together. So in this video, I'm going to give you my take on the midpoint, which, based on the study of literally hundreds of movies, I've named the monster moment. Now before we start, I try to order these craft videos so each one builds off those previous. I know some of you want me to move on to more advanced stuff, but please be patient because I need to build a baseline for less experienced viewers. And if you are one of the less experienced, it behooves you to watch some of the videos earlier in the series, which I've compiled in the playlist you can click on above. I'll be talking about act structure, which I discussed in this video, along with a character arc, which I covered in this one. Now, all the mystery surrounding the midpoint comes from the same kerfuffle I talked about in my very first video. It's called the 3-act structure when there's actually 4 acts, because when Sid Field introduced his famous paradigm in 1979, he failed to notice that the midpoint was a thing. But not only is it a thing, it's the thing that splits his way too long middle act into 2 clearly separate acts. Now, Sid did correct his error in a later book, but it was already too late. Most people were using this paradigm and not that one, simply because most people read Sid's first book, but not his second one. But Sid himself didn't have much of an idea as to what this mysterious 5th element did. He literally just says that around page 60, something happens to link the 2 courses of action.
Gee, can you bake that up for me?
And when subsequent authors tried to explain it, those who actually bothered to mention the midpoint, we got a wild hodgepodge of explanations. Some are purely plot-based, others are character-focused, as in the character stops acting this way, starts acting this way. Some are even theme-focused. The problem here is one I find in screencraft all the time. If you want to understand story structure, you can't look at just the plot or just the character arc or the 2 of them as 2 separate entities. What we call a movie's story is in fact a composite structure made up of all 3 story elements, plot, character, and theme, working together. So if we study a movie's first half in terms of how the plot arc and the character arc interact, the purpose of the midpoint becomes clear. Now, I've already explained this structural interaction somewhat in the 2 previously mentioned videos. But to recap, in a traditional Hollywood-style movie story, the protagonist begins with a faulty psychological paradigm. By that I mean they view some aspect of themselves, other people, or the world in an inaccurate or unhelpful way, what's more commonly called their fatal flaw. Then, at the story's inciting incident, a problematic situation arises that compels the protagonist to take some sort of action in response. Now, the inciting incident does differ somewhat depending on whether we're dealing with an antagonism-driven story or a protagonism-driven story, which I explained in my previous video. You can click on that above if you want to know what I'm talking about. But the rest of the structure remains relatively the same for both types. Now, right after the inciting incident, the protagonist might feel reluctant to act, they might only be preparing for the adventure, or if they do take immediate action, there still remains an option for them to back out, go home, and just forget about the whole thing. But this all ends at the end of Act 1 turning point. It's generally agreed that the end of Act 1 turning point serves as the story's point of no return. Whether it's by a conscious decision by the character or because something forces them into it, something occurs that compels the protagonist to fully commit themselves to seeing the adventure through to its end. Neo takes the red pill. Luke leaves with Obi-Wan. Dorothy begins her journey down the yellow brick road. There's no turning back now. The characters are in it for the long haul. So begins Act 2A, which is all about characters taking action in response to the problematic situation. But they bring all their faults and flaws along with them. By that I mean the character takes actions based on their old familiar means and methods, which inevitably prove faulty or inadequate. So, whether the character realizes it or not, this faulty path ends up making the situation worse and worse, making it more difficult or more complicated. Though the hero might have great confidence in their actions, they're actually digging themselves into a hole.
No, that's okay. I'm pretty sure I can struggle my way out. First, I'll just reach in and pull my legs out. Now I'll pull my arms out with my face.
And this all comes back to bite them in the butt at the midpoint. A crisis event occurs as a result of previous actions. Some way or somehow, the protagonist's efforts have ended up creating or entrapping them in a situation much worse than the one before. A situation much more difficult, much more monstrous. For example, in Back to the Future, Marty gets stuck in the year 1955. Now that's bad enough, but then Marty makes dumb mistakes that eventually result in a major crisis. At the midpoint, Marty finds he's altered history in a way that might wipe him out of existence. Marty took a bad situation and made it worse. Likewise in Die Hard, John McClane is the type of guy who always tries to avoid direct confrontation. So he just wants to get the police to come to solve the problem for him. But when he succeeds at the midpoint, he finds the cops are a bunch of incompetent dopes. He's taken a bad situation, made it worse. And Raise the Lost Ark, Indy's too open and careless in his search for the Ark, letting his enemies know what he's up to. So, at the midpoint when he finds the treasure, his enemies just show up and take it away from him. I call this crisis the monster moment in reference to the story of Dr. Frankenstein. Victor Frankenstein is pursuing the scientific breakthrough of the century, but through his hubris, he ends up creating an abomination that now threatens to destroy his entire life. By following a faulty path, Frankenstein creates his own monster, and he has no one to blame but himself. The same thing happens in practically every movie story. The protagonist's previous attitudes and behaviors are always in some way to blame for the more monstrous situation that arises at the midpoint. My favorite example is 1979's Alien, because it presents the most literal monster moment you'll ever find. The story begins with the crew investigating a signal from a spooky planet. Bad idea. Then one of the crew gets too curious and an alien creature attaches to his face. Again, bad idea. The crew then crosses its point of no return when they violate protocol to bring the attached creature onto the ship. Again, that's a bad idea. Then throughout Act 2A, the crew continually underestimates the creature's threat and even assumes the danger's past. Then this happens. Through all their poor decisions, the Nostromo crew have ended up creating their own monster, and they have no one to blame but themselves. Now, like all things in story structure, this progression is flexible to the type of story being told, so it comes in all shapes and sizes. In some stories, we're quite aware that the protagonist is ignorantly bumbling their way into an increasingly worse situation. Then, at the crisis, the bottom really falls out, and the protagonist has to admit just how screwed they are. But at other times, we're led to believe the hero is doing everything right, only for the crisis to come as a shock and a surprise. In other stories, the protagonist is painfully aware of their desperate situation from the very start. Now, the story might still stick it to him with a midpoint crisis, but this is actually unnecessary in this situation, as the character is already aware that they're in a deep, dark hole. So instead, the midpoint might present itself as a glimmer of salvation. The question is whether the hero is sensible enough to take it. In yet a fourth permutation, the protagonist willingly creates a more monstrous situation at the midpoint, but fails to recognize this error until it's too late, resulting in a delayed crisis not fully felt until late Act 2B. You'll find this a lot in stories that end tragically. The hero fails because they don't recognize the truth of the situation until it's too late. Likewise, how much the protagonist is genuinely to blame for the monster moment can also vary. While Marty McFly is totally at fault, and Indiana Jones and John McClane are partially to blame, Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz's only mistake is naively thinking she can just ask for what she wants instead of earning it for herself. Similarly, Luke Skywalker's problem is that he is so young and inexperienced that he just passively goes along with Obi-Wan's plans. While Luke's passivity isn't directly to blame for the heroes getting captured, it still led Luke right into the belly of the beast. Likewise in Titanic, while Rose and Jack certainly didn't cause the ship to hit the iceberg, their previous actions are to blame for the midpoint crisis that sees Jack trapped below decks. Okay, so character action ends up creating a midpoint crisis. But what exactly makes this event so structurally important that it appears in practically every good movie? What makes this event the middle mast that props up the center of a 2-hour story? Well, it's simply because a crisis demands a response. When faced with a crisis, characters have to stop, reevaluate the situation, and then choose a new course of action to overcome that crisis. This firstly does what Sid Field pointed out. The crisis and response splits the story's middle into two clearly separate courses of action. In Act 2A, the character digs himself into a hole. At the midpoint, the crisis reveals they're in a hole. In Act 2B, they climb out of the hole. Second, and more importantly, the need for a response creates an ideal situation to motivate the most important moment of the character arc, what I call the moment of crucial decision. The moment of crucial decision is that fatal crossroads where the protagonist must either commit to a path of change or rejects change and remains on the faulty path. Now you'll see that in a lot of movies, the monster moment is immediately followed by the moment of crucial decision. This is because the crisis forces a character to reevaluate all they've done thus far, and then choose how to adjust their actions. Now a wise protagonist learns a lesson from the crisis. They see that their old ways are what put them in the hole. So now they gotta figure out better, more effective ways of thinking and acting to get out of that hole. But a foolish protagonist refuses to learn a lesson. So they respond to the crisis by escalating their faulty behaviors even more. But, as you can imagine, this will only lead to further ruin.
How are we gonna get out of here?
We'll dig our way out.
However, as I've said, structure is flexible, and a lot of movies have good reason to delay the moment of crucial decision until much later in the story. Yet still, the protagonist must respond to the midpoint crisis by taking a new course of action. But what happens in this case is that this new course inevitably proves to be as faulty as the first one, leading to yet another crisis at the end of Act 2B, providing yet another ideal place for the moment of crucial decision. But all this splitting of paths makes the second half of story structure much stickier to explain, so I'm going to leave that till next time. In the meanwhile, try to think of what the monster moment might be in some of your favorite movies. How does the character respond to the crisis? Do they undergo their crucial decision, or does the story leave that in reserve until later? And as usual, you'll find this stuff and more in my books, Screenwriting Down the Atoms and Screenwriting the Unified Theory of Narrative. If you have any questions about the midpoint, go ahead and leave them in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. And as always, please click the like button because it really helps the channel get seen by more people. It really does. I'm getting close to 1,000 subscribers right now, so I just want to thank everyone who's subscribed so far, especially those people who watch my videos as soon as they're posted. I love you guys. So until next time, I'm the Script Monk. Auf Wiedersehen.